This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest this episode, Ben Apatoff, author of Metallica, the $24.95 book. Metallica, the $24.95 book, features an in-depth look at Metallica's cultural significance with chapters devoted to each member, each album, touring, fashion, books, film, influences, fandom, and more, exploring the band's ideologies along the way. With over 125 million records sold worldwide, Metallica is the biggest metal band of all time. 4 decades into their unparalleled career, Metallica is a massive cultural force who drastically changed the sound of popular music by creating their own rules. Yet for all their popularity, Metallica can seem impenetrable, raising more questions and inspiring more discourse as their mythos grows. Metallica questions run deeper than what people find on the internet. Metallica questions deserve a book. Metallica, the $24.95 book, is that book. Ben Apatoff provides an in-depth look at the band and their music that both diehard fans and Metallica beginners can enjoy. Ben Apatoff is a New York writer and educator whose work has appeared in Metal Injection, MetalSucks, and the Morbid Anatomy Museum. He was born the summer Metallica released Kill 'Em All. To hear a playlist of the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Ben, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
So let's get the question out of the way up front. For those who are listening who may not be Metallica diehards, what is the meaning behind the book title, the $24.95 book?
Well, it came to me on a whim, actually, but in the 80s, Metallica used to put the price on some of their merchandise to keep retailers from overcharging. So there's Garage Days Revisited, which is the $5.98 EP. There's Cliff 'Em All, the movie tribute to Cliff, which is the 1998 home video. So I wanted to do something like that, and the title is kind of plastered on the cover in the same sort of way.
What's cool is the Metallica fans know exactly what that means.
Yeah, I wanted to be kind of like a real ones know one. I didn't want to call it like the Masters of Puppets or something like, the Enter Sandman. I wanted to be something that like people who are serious fans would appreciate and get.
You begin the book by pointing out a 2017 review of a Metallica concert in Denver, Colorado. Clearly, this writer was not a fan. He compared the atmosphere of the concert with its pyrotechnics, trademark militaristic drumming, and what was described as violent imagery projected behind them to a Hitler rally. Heavy metal in general has been on the receiving end of this type of characterization since it began late 60s, early 70s with bands like Black Sabbath and Zeppelin and Deep Purple. Metallica really became the target starting in the 80s when they rose to fame.
Yeah, something I wrote about them in the book is that they always kind of seem like, maybe especially as a metal band, outsiders in the mainstream. They can be the world's biggest metal band, people's favorite token metal band, and yet they're never going to be invited to play the Academy Awards or the White House or the Super Bowl or the way that some of the artists of their stature might be. And they've taken metal further. And, the woman who wrote the foreword, Lena, writes about how it was kind of a political act the way they broke down boundaries and made metal that was appreciated and accessible by so many different people. But even there, by taking it that far, they still get that kind of opposition. And, even after 125 million records, there'll be people who be like, oh, this is like a Hitler rally. One of the last times I saw them, I remember they had protesters outside, you're going to hell, you're going to hell. And they still inspire that kind of opposition, even as one of the hugest bands of all time.
You mentioned Lena in the foreword. That's Lena Dawes. If you could talk about her and how did you get her to do the foreword?
Lena Dawes is a talented author. She wrote a book called What Are You Doing Here?, which is about being a black woman going to metal shows. And I actually had not read that book until I saw a piece about Injustice for All in Billboard that she wrote some comments for. And reading her comments made me think, wow, that's a smart take on Metallica. So I reached out to her for the book. It was important for me to get a great writer. It was important for me to get somebody who could demolish metal stereotypes. We've all seen the idea that metal is a boys' club, that's anti-intellectual, it's predominantly white. Lena is none of those things. And I wanted someone who offered, a really smart take on them, something, different from my perspective. And I've been appreciating seeing reviews about that piece that have said, we like that it starts with kind of an academic tone and then goes to a more personal tone. I wanted there to be a contrast. I didn't want there to be someone who approached it from my perspective. And going back to what I said about wanting to be someone who was a good writer, I thought maybe I could pull some strings and reach out to someone in a famous band. But more important than getting someone from Lamb of God or something like that, I want someone who could write a really smart, good piece on Metallica. And she was, one of the first people I thought of.
The first chapter gets into that firing of guitarist Dave Mustaine. That's the well-known story. You write that it's the most notable thing they ever did, the most controversial event in any metal career. April 11th, 1983. They're just weeks away from recording their classic debut album, Kill 'Em All. They give Dave a ticket for a 4-day trip back to California. Early live reviews showed that Dave, he's the rock star in the making. He's incredibly talented, destined for greatness, stardom and infamy, but not with Metallica. Singer-guitarist James Hetfield and drummer Lars Ulrich had been secretly planning to give Mustaine the boot. They already had Kirk Hammett in mind to be the band's lead guitarist. Was the firing due to personal reasons, professional reasons? Was it both?
It sounds like it's a lot of things, which is part of why that story has stayed so much in metal culture. I mean, obviously, both Dave and Metallica got so much bigger after that story happened. But if he hadn't got big, it would have been like Pete Best and the Beatles. Like, what's up? Some guy who's just famous for that. But it gets so much more compelling when you realize that he became the second biggest thrash metal band of his time. And I think that there are so many different accounts. You know, Dave has said different things over the years. James and Lars have said different things. There's so much to speculate on. And part of why I make the case that's the most controversial point is that it has so many unsolvable mysteries, like what could have been, or what really happened, or who's telling the truth, or were they right to do it? It's kind of mortally dubious that they kept his music. Some people think that they would have been better if they'd kept him instead of Kirk. So, would Exodus have gotten a lot bigger if Kirk had stayed there? And, he co-wrote many of Metallica's best songs. So how would they have sounded differently? So it just raises so many questions. And just there's this incredible pathos for Dave, too, who just can't let it go. And just interview after interview, they never should have kicked me out. No, I got those guys. And it's kind of fascinating and tragic to walk. I mean, there's something almost like Paradise Lost about it, about, Satan, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. I mean, there's so much to explore with that story, which is part of why it's such a fascinating part of metal.
It is interesting. It's kind of sad to think that no matter how much success he had in Megadeth, that never really, although he seemed to cool off a little bit over the years, in recent years, they've kind of mended fences somewhat.
Yeah, it seems like he has. I mean, they've said the feud is over and started again, so we'll see where that goes. And I mean, he's had a famously contentious persona, but I think that there's something fascinating about how restless he is about that. And a lot of people, outsiders, would say, well, I would love to be in a band as big as Megadeth, but for Dave, that's just not good enough. And there's that famous scene in Some Kind of Monster where they meet up again, and after all those barbs in the press, he just says, I'm not happy being second best, not to you guys. And it's honestly, I'm sympathetic to it. I know that some people make fun of him for it, but I think that there's something kind of sad and touching about the fact that he has this thing that happened when he's in his early 20s that just still weighs on him. And you wonder how much of Megadeth's success is his competitive needs. I mean, he really upped his game and became a much better guitarist and songwriter and lyricist. And how much of his success is just by that drive to compete with Metallica. And he's such a fascinating.
Yeah, I was about to say how much that plays into how good Megadeth was. That was the driving force. That was the fire under his ass to get out there and one up them if he could.
Absolutely, yeah. And it was also just fascinating, too, to read early accounts. Like the first ever review of Metallica was they were opening up for Saxon, and it's like a one-sentence review that's like, this is a band that doesn't have any talent except for that guitarist who's got like almost an Eddie Van Halen like presence to him. And it's such a incredible story about how like he was, the one who talked most on stage. He was, this songwriting force and this stage presence and a soloing talent, and people were in awe of him, and they still, how bad did it get that they had to kick him out?
Yeah. As we know, he went on to form Megadeth and had a hugely successful career. And meanwhile, Metallica's lineup after Mustaine is out is now James Hetfield on lead vocals and rhythm guitar, Kirk Hammett on lead guitar, Cliff Burton on bass, Lars Ulrich on drums. A quote from James leads off chapter 3. He said, quote, I get to put my loves, fears, hates, question marks into this music, and it definitely helps me. Talk about his story a bit, if you can, and how it formed him as an artist. His mother's death when he was 16 is probably the moment that really impacted him the most.
Yeah. I wonder about that because for many years he didn't talk about that in music. He didn't talk about that on record. He starts on Injustice for All. He writes Dyer's Eve. And then, The God That Failed is a very powerful song about Christian Science. He sort of reconciles with his dad, supposedly. And then, he appears in the movie Absent. It's just like, I hated him. I was so, he left a note and didn't even mention me in it. And it was, it's funny because people think of him, he has such a kind of forceful, tough DJF attitude sometimes, but also like so much of his drive is he's like, I want to rock people. He's got a quote like, I want to like rock the crowd into liking me. And he's kind of looking for family and acceptance. And He talks about his bandmates that way more than the other guys do. And he says, Bob and Ray Burton, Cliff's dad, these are like my father figures, and these guys are my brothers. And he's pretty much orphaned at age 16. And you see that finding a family is so important to him and drives his songwriting and his stage presence. And I think that his sense of loss and loneliness is so relatable that no matter how many millions of records he sells, he can just express that thing to so many. He says, I put my question marks and my loss in the music, and so many people can hear it and say, this is for me. I feel that too, no matter how popular or rich he gets.
Sort of a heavy metal John Lennon. There's some parallels there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, with the mother thing. John Lennon had issues with his family, and I think that's a fair comparison.
Before we talk about that debut album, Kill 'Em All, I didn't know that the band was auditioning third guitarist and actively seeking a new singer, particularly Armored Saint singer John Bush, who would later become Anthrax's lead singer, right?
That's right. And it's funny, if you look at older metal lineups, that was usually the case where they have two guitarists, a drummer, bassist, and then a frontman who didn't play an instrument, like Bruce Dickinson, like Rob Halford. If you want to count AC/DC, like Bon Scott or Brian Johnson. And they were really working on the lineup, and they really wanted John Bush to be the frontman. And it is kind of interesting to think. John Bush, he's got a great voice. It would have probably changed the band a lot. And John Bush really seems at peace with that. He doesn't seem like, it could have been, he's like, James is great, and I'm happy with Armored Saint and my family and Anthrax. But yeah, it is also kind of fun to think about that they, and also just, James kind of developing into his kind of commanding stage persona that he has now, because now he's clearly like a leader on stage. But all this talk about would have been great to see Metallica in a club, and yeah, I would have loved to have. But if you hear like the young demos, he's losing his voice, he's getting winded, his banter sounds like a little unsure of himself, and he really develops into a more powerful stage presence 5 or 6 years later.
And the initial title idea for the band's first album was Metal Up Your Ass. Distributors balked at that. Metallica weren't happy with that either. Bassist Cliff Burton says, we should just kill them all in response to their label Megaforce's concerns, and thus a now iconic title is born. Cliff also had the idea for the album cover art, and that's an ambiguous image.
Yeah, you don't know if the hammer is being picked up, if it's just being put down because it just killed someone. You don't know if it's a person defending themselves or attacking someone. It's a great, powerful image. There's so much kind of mystery in it. And I like to think that artists should have artistic control, and I like to think that, I'm anti-censorship and stuff like that. But it's a much more powerful cover and image than Metal Up Your Ass. Metal Up Your Ass it's a funny title. It's a funny T-shirt, and the toilet bowl with the dagger sticking out of it. It's funny, but it would have been a lot harder to take Metallica seriously. Part of the appeal is that sense of realism that they brought to music. And that was kind of like an older metal image. Like maybe one of the new wave of British heavy metal guys could have done that with the toilet bowl and the Metal Up Your Ass. But I think Kill 'Em All is such it's realistic, it's ambiguous. Metal Up Your Ass is funny, but I think Kill 'Em All is such a harder and even scarier image because you don't know what's going on there. And it's they'd probably agree too. I think the label is right to insist they change the title.
Oh, I absolutely agree. That's more of a Steel Panther type of title.
Yeah, it is like Steel Panther.
Yeah.
It'd be perfect for Steel Panther. That's right, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of what ifs in early Metallica history, right? What if they called it that? What if Dave Mustaine stayed? What if John Bush was there? Yeah, chapter 4 on Kill 'Em All says it all, by the way. Full speed or nothing. It opens with Hit the Lights, manic, fist-in-your-face energy, James belting it out, and you really hear the band's Motorhead influence here. One of the band's many influences you devote a chapter to. Can you talk about their influences?
They came along at a time when punk and metal were enemies even, and things have changed so much that it's hard to remember that happened. But you think about the things that they brought to it, whether it's like covers album of covering punk songs like on Garage Days, or dressing like their fans. I think that that's really what helped distinguish them from their influences. I guess Motorhead's probably maybe the clearest influence on them, with that kind of combination of punk and metal and that full speed. Black Sabbath obviously influenced every metal band. Reading their interviews more is kind of interesting to see how much Thin Lizzy influenced them, and thinking more about how they did transition into more of a hard rock type sound. You can hear that early on with the Thin Lizzy influence. Diamond Head obviously owe much of their career over the last 30 years to Metallica, just kind of saying their name and bringing them up in the press. So yeah, those are most of the biggest influences, I'd say.
Well, let's get to Lars Ulrich. He is a lightning rod. He's a frequent target of criticism. And you write, to hear some fans tell it, Lars is Metallica's Mike Love. Mike Love of the Beach Boys, the ruthless megalomaniacal businessman who exploits his position in one of America's greatest bands by taking advantage of the tormented genius who writes the songs. He also takes his share of hits regarding his abilities as a drummer. And you write, people who complain about Lars drumming might also tell you Kurt Cobain is a bad guitarist or that David Lee Roth is not a good singer. Lars is often sloppy and simplified his kit down to a six-piece after the Black Album, but Lars has a distinguished feel and endurance that Metallica's classic records are unimaginable without. You feel a lot of fans take unnecessary or uncalled for shots at Lars as a drummer?
I think people don't like Lars personally. People resent that he enjoys being a rock star. You know, metal does have this idea that you're supposed to be anti-establishment and cool. Lars is more openly comfortable with that than a lot of people are. You know, he's okay with dating models and, you know, giving lots of interviews and appearing on game shows and stuff like that. It's fine. That kind of makes him a journalist favorite sometimes because he's so open to that kind of thing. He's very business minded. You know, people, I think like James and Kirk is kind of more artistic. But Lars has a distinguished chemistry. He's got a feel. You can see early on that they owe a lot of their success and drive to him. You know, they'll be talking about how, yeah, we were teenagers on tour in Europe with Venom. We didn't know where our next hotel was, where our meal was, who was paying us. And Lars had that all worked out. And he kind of wills his way into things very well. You know, I mean, he could barely play the drums on his first rehearsal, but he stepped up. One of his friends said something like, it just never seemed to cross his mind that he could not be a rock star. And he really does have the drive. And I'd say he does have a lot of chemistry on the drums. I think that his accessibility is part of what makes him such an influential drummer. A lot of people cut their teeth learning how to play his parts. I think that, you know, Kurt Cobain and David Lee Roth are comparisons as people who are not thought of as like technically gifted, and someone who might go to the Berklee School of Music would think like, that guy really. But they have a chemistry that people who can play circles around them don't really have. You know, I write about how there's that album where Dream Theater on tour played Master of Puppets. They covered the whole album front to back, and they can play circles around any of the guys in Metallica, you know, including Lars, but they don't embody the songs. I think that Lars has a chemistry. He embodies the songs. I think that he has an imitable, distinct style. I think that he builds the song. Greg Fidelman said he's a very song-driven drummer, I guess, in the way that you might say Dave Grohl is, where he's got like a song inside the song. His drums have a great kind of like air drumming feel to them. He's a very melodic, tuneful drummer that, and I really appreciate that. No matter how much people say, well, he's not as fast as Dave Lombardo or anything like that. I don't think that matters in Metallica. I think he's good with that. James talks about his endurance. He's got like a lot of energy for this stuff. I think that he's great for the band.
He really pushes the guys in the band. Like that scene from Some Kind of Monster. He's telling James, it's stock.
Oh, yeah.
It's stock.
Yeah.
What do you mean stock? I don't know. It's just stock. What?
Yeah. You know,
he's not afraid to just say it.
Exactly. Like who among us would tell James Hetfield that his riff is stock? You know, like nobody. You know, it's I think, you know, Keith. I'm gonna screw up the quote, but Keith Richards has a quote in his book along the lines of, I think Mick knows how important it is to have one person left who will say no to him and tell him when he's wrong. And I think that James and Lars have that. James is clearly so much of the creative talent, and Lars will still be like, it's stock, you know? I mean, he's so fearless and sticking up to James that way, and I think that really drives them both.
Makes you think maybe Lars would make a really good producer.
Yeah, I bet he would. You know, it's funny. He doesn't really like to do music stuff outside of Metallica. He's only played on one song. He played on a Merciful Fate song outside Metallica, but yeah, I think he would be a good producer if he ever wanted to produce. I mean, his kids are in a band now. He might produce them, but we'll see.
I want to ask you about my personal favorite Metallica album, Ride the Lightning. The band's second album came out July of 1984. I didn't hear this until around 89. The one video was out, and I heard my friends talking about Metallica, but I wasn't interested enough that I wanted to invest in this band more. I love the song One. I love the video, of course. It was, you know, there was some burnout there. It was played all the time, but it wasn't that I wasn't interested. I just something wasn't pulling me in. But then my older brother had the cassette of Ride the Lightning. That's the one that really spoke to me. That's the album where I said, yep, I get it. I knew what my friends were talking about. From that cover with that big, beautiful logo, the lightning bolts coming down onto the electric chair, the 8 tracks. As you're right, Ride the Lightning is not as consistently heavy, but it's darker and more varied than Kill 'Em All. They were already evolving on that second album.
Oh, totally. Yeah. They're so different. Part of what I read about in the book is that they were pretty much a different band by then. I mean, Kill 'Em All is mostly written by James, Lars, and Dave. And Ride the Lightning is James, Kirk, Cliff, and Lars. And they've changed so much by then. I'll be 100% honest. My first Metallica record, not because I'm cool, but because it was what I could find in a used store, was Kill 'Em All. And I was like, this is great. And then I got Ride the Lightning afterwards. And I kind of had like the older than me fan experience of like, this is different. I have to, because like it starts off kind of slow and the songs are more stretched out and it had to kind of grow on me. And it is a really different record and it takes some real in-depth listening and catching up to. And once you do, it's one of the greatest records ever made. But it's such a challenging piece of music. It's great.
One song that stands out as one that's a lot like what they did on the Black Album, For Whom the Bell Tolls.
Yeah, that's true. It's got that kind of like moderate pacing to it that the Black Album would have. And it's funny, I think the Black Album changed things so much that it made rock radio safe for songs like For Whom the Bell Tolls. Like that comes out in 1984 and it's a little more accessible, but it's weird. I mean, there are all those different tune changes. There's all those different like time signature changes and different melodies before I think it's like 2 minutes before the lyrics come in and just all these different things happening. Like it's a unusual song, but I think after the Black Album, that song sounds like something that you could put on modern hard rock radio. And the Black Album kind of made it safer and stuff like that. And now, it's like EMC squared. You hear it now and you're like, oh, yeah, that is something that could be on the radio. But you hear it back then, like it just sounds like nothing.
Yeah, it starts off with, it sounds like Hell's Bells from AC/DC. And then after that, you're like, nope, this is not AC/DC. They make it their own after that.
Yeah.
It just goes off into its own direction. That's one of my all-time favorite Metallica songs. And Cliff Burton, his influence here is significant. He brings in the harmonic and the melodic side to the music on this album. The classical influences there. 6 of 8 songs he co-writes. And it's evident from that juxtaposition of the lead track, Fight Fire with Fire. Like you said, that soft, melodic, acoustic piece followed by the high-speed aggression.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many different moods on that record. It's funny because taken as a whole, you can often hear it as like full speed ahead metal. But like if you really get down to it, there's different parts of Fight Fire with Fire. There's Fade to Black on it. Call of Cthulhu is very different. It's got so many moods. It's such a human record. It's so varied. And after Kill 'Em All, which really is full speed or nothing, just a quick, heavy, fast blast of noise. And you just hear how much they've expanded in just months after it came out.
There's a warmer sound to the production, too. They brought in Flemming Rasmussen and Mark Whitaker as producers. Yeah. There's a great story, an early struggling rock band story in your book regarding Rasmussen. The band couldn't afford a hotel, so they lived in his studio free of charge, and Rasmussen's wife, Pernille, not too happy about this?
Yeah. She would complain about the guys, and, Lars would know what she was saying because he spoke Danish and the other guys didn't, and I guess she trooped through it, and Flemming came back for the next 2 records, and they had something magic. Did you hear Flemming say it wasn't him, it was the band? And he says, people approach me all the time to say, like, give us that Ride the Lightning or Master of Puppets sound. And it's like, well, I can't make it because that was the band doing it at the time.
The next album, Master of Puppets, is another Metallica classic. The last album featuring Cliff Burton, he sadly died in a bus accident in Sweden during the album's promotional tour. This hit the band members hard, and Cliff has gone on to become, among the heavy metal community, a legendary figure. You write, punk rock sophistication doesn't go anywhere near capturing the bundle of eccentricities piled up in one Cliff Burton. If you could talk about Cliff, the person, he was a loner, but a guy with tremendous confidence, and the other members turned to him a lot, right? I get the feeling he was one of those, like an old soul. He was beyond his years. He was only 24 when he passed, but he seemed to be the guy they would turn to as almost an elder figure.
They do, and it's funny. He was the oldest member of the band, and they talk about him being the wisest, and he was the most musically trained, and he'd be able to write down time signatures and play by ear. He had a real masterful sense of music and list of influences, and you see interviews, and he'll talk about like REM before they're famous, and he can talk about like punk and classical and all sorts of stuff. James says this thing about like, he just kind of had this don't give a fuckness, and that was something that I really looked up to. And you see that he wears bell bottoms, he doesn't dress like a typical metalhead. Ross Halfin talks about what a pain he is to photograph because he doesn't want to pose. He's like, I just want to be. But he seems so assured of who he is and so doesn't care what other people think. And they make fun of the clothes he wears, his hat. He's just like, I don't care. And I think that they really took that with them.
Are there any documentaries out there worth seeing on Cliff?
There is one documentary that his sister made, which is a little strange. It's called Salvation Kingdom. And It's touching. It's very low budget. It has a conclusion that a lot of people would not agree with, I'd say. But one thing about Cliff is that because he died young, kind of like Jimi Hendrix or Kurt Cobain, people like to project their ideas on him. And a lot of people have an idea if Cliff had lived, Metallica never would have made a big hit record like the Black Album. Or if Cliff had lived, he would have expanded his various influences and they would have gotten even bigger. And people have different ideas. At the end of the movie, she presents some ideas about Cliff. I think a lot of the fans would be like, that is not Cliff. But Cliff is another what if story about Metallica. He's kind of a puzzle.
The story of his death, it's reminiscent of that Buddy Holly plane crash. Guitarist Tommy Alsop flips a coin with Richie Valens for a seat on the plane. In Cliff's story, Metallica is leaving Stockholm. The band drew cards to see who would get the best bunk. Kirk Hammett shuffled the deck. Cliff cut it. In Kirk's memory, Cliff drew the ace of spades. Kirk drew the two of hearts. Went to his new bunk, fell asleep with a book he'd been reading, Stephen King's It. When the bus crashed, Cliff didn't make it. I can't imagine how hard that had to have been for Kirk. I know he talked about it in the Behind the Music episode for VH1, how difficult that was. You just can't imagine how hard that must have been. That's his last memory of Cliff.
Yeah, I can't either. It's funny, Kirk, he often seems like the most laid-back and pleasant guy in Metallica. He's a surfer. He's, by all accounts, people who've interviewed him say he's just like a very nice stoner guy. He's into Buddhism and TM, and this kind of relaxed, laid-back guy with the more intense personas like James and Lars, or the more flamboyant ones like Rob or Cliff. But if you read his story, he has so many demons, and you see he's kind of like so... You get the sense that he's in part at peace with the world because he just has this profound sense of what is and is not important. And, just like thinking about Cliff and mortality and his terrible upbringing. And you hear the force and power that he puts into his playing with that. And, I do wonder about that with Cliff and how that weighs with him. I know Waylon Jennings felt awful about Buddy Holly for the rest of his life.
Right. Waylon Jennings. Yeah. What's cool about Kirk, he's a huge classic horror movie fan like I am, and he's got a massive collection of those classic horror movie posters.
Yeah, one of my favorite finds while putting together the book, I guess he's had some exhibits and he had some books about his horror collection, and the books are terrific. He really has these detailed captions about what they mean and who's the best actor and, what bad movies have good posters and vice versa. And he really gets into, and he writes in the book about his abusive upbringing and how his comic and horror collection brings him to a time before that happened, kind of makes that come alive for him and he takes refuge in it. But he writes very thoughtfully about how that was a time when that was the only thing that you could use to sell movies, and there weren't coming attractions, there weren't radio ads, and people just invested in making these gorgeous posters and props and sets and stuff like that. And he has a real appreciation for it that I really enjoyed reading about in his books.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. Cliff Burton's last album with Metallica is Master of Puppets, 1986. It went top 30. While it was a hit with fans, critics praised it as well. What a way to leave a legacy for Cliff Burton. Your thoughts on Master of Puppets?
I love Master of Puppets. There is this kind of like, it almost has this like Citizen Kane or Godfather type feel where when people say, people just name it, or like kind of Blue and Jazz, where it's just kind of like the token greatest metal album of all time. It's the only metal album so far in the Library of Congress for the National Registry. It's the kind of go-to greatest metal album, even if it isn't necessarily people's favorite Metallica record. It is an incredible record for Cliff, just those 3 albums, and then that's gone just quite in less than in 3 years. Yeah, so 83, 84, and 86 is when those records come out. But it's a great record. It still sounds heavy. It's when people talk about the greatest metal records of all time, there's some that you could say, well, that's more hard rock. You can't really say that about Master of Puppets. It's so interesting. It's got all these different lyrical ideas, and the music is so advanced. It's just an absolutely masterful record.
We talked about the influence Cliff Burton had. What was the songwriting process, and is it any different now than it was then? Who came to the table with a song idea, or was it various guys in the band?
It seems like it's mostly James. There are some ideas that have gone from the other ones. You've read about how parts of Orion, for example, were written by Cliff for the band, and they had a more organic process of writing. Nowadays, maybe less so. I know that Hardwired was the first Metallica record since Kill 'Em All that didn't have Kirk songwriting contributions. I think that, and they've talked about certain eras like Injustice for All, where Lars and James kind of had the shackles on everybody in their own words, or how they've locked Jason out of the songwriting process. So I think they've gone through different phases with it. On Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets in particular, they're songs written by all 4 people. But it seems like it's mainly James comes to the band with ideas and Lars nudges Kirk on his solos or James on his riffs and stuff like that.
Jason Newsted, he comes in to the picture here, 1988, and Justice for All. He's on that album, and that's another huge commercial and critical success. But the mix was highly criticized, and you write about this in the book. Now, it's interesting that this came out the same year that my band Van Halen came out with OU812, and the exact same problem. Very little bass, somewhat of a thin mix. Why was the mix so thin? Why is there so little bass in it? There was wasn't there the story that they intentionally did that because Jason was brand new?
Yeah, that's another thing is that it's like the Dave firing where there's a million different stories. Lars has changed his story. James has changed his story. The producers have said that Lars told them to turn it down. And then they've said, yeah, we came and saw Lars the Rock Hall of Fame. He said, hey, why did you guys turn it down? And Lars, you were the one who told us to. So Lars has changed his story. James has said that, it was the scoop tones. It was the range. It was Jason playing along identically with what James did and getting overwhelmed by it. Jason has said, I was so in the dirt with that and so upset about that. But he's also defended the mix. And I think part of what's fascinating about that record, too, is the way that people have gone into it deeper because of the lack of bass. They just reissued it for the box set, and people are like, well, maybe we're finally hear the bass. Nope, still can't hear the bass. But people get a lot deeper into the songs, and they try to elevate the bass tracks, or they, try to play what they think Cliff would have played on it, or they try to play what they think Jason would have played if they heard it. And Jason has said, yeah, that's nice, but it sounds the way it's supposed to sound. And I think that adds to the mystery to it. I think kind of like OU812, there's a hazing the bassist rumor about it. Jason was famously hazed, and, there's talk about that for Michael Anthony too, but it's just another permanent question about that record. It's also such a puzzling record to begin with. There's so many different, the songs are so unusual on that record.
Metallica is under a microscope, much like a lot of the bands that have a huge following like that. Everything, especially later in their career, the mix on certain albums as you get towards the 2000s, that's something they've had to deal with for a long time. I think it might have been Kirk who said that the critics may be bad, but they're not as harsh on us as we are.
Yeah, that's true. And you can kind of see that in Metallica's restlessness and the way that they keep trying to do new things. They keep working on it. One thing I talk about in the book is how in his review of Some Kind of Monster, Roger Ebert, who likes the movie, says, but the one thing I don't get is why don't they quit? They've got nice families. They've got millions of dollars. They've got a legacy. They're at each other's throats. They don't like each other. A lot of people are stuck in their jobs. Metallica has a choice. Why don't they just quit? And the fact is that they can't, is that they just need to make new music. It's just part of their blood. It's just who they are. It's like air to them. And that's part of what's inspiring to watch them is they just need music and they need to try new things and they need to be their worst critics and try to make something better and try to improve.
And although Metallica has never been a political band, you write that this album lyrically is very much political. You call it Metallica at War.
Absolutely. I've got a quote from Toni Morrison in the book about how all art is political. And, the ones that claim not to be are happy with the status quo. And I think part of what makes Injustice for All such a compelling political moral record is that it's vague to the point of sort of a timelessness. I'll listen to, and I love Rage Against the Machine songs or Dead Kennedy songs that get really into political moments. I'm like, this is such a powerful statement about this thing that's going in politics in 1993 or like in 1985. And, I get a little into the books and the events that inspired songs on Injustice for All, but they're written about broadly enough that they can be relevant today when you have your political worries or anxieties and you can put on Injustice for All today and it will still feel relevant because they write about politics in a vague and broad enough term. And even for many different ideologies, I'm sure people from different political spectrums could listen to that record and be like, this is like me. This is how I'm feeling. And this speaks to me. That's probably what makes it such a compelling record is it gives this voice to people to express themselves like that.
The video for one being 15, 16, 17 years old, that exposed me to the viciousness of war and the isolation that someone can feel. You devote a chapter to Metallica's videos. The one video was a massive success. What effect do you think that video had on the band? Good, bad, little of both? I
guess probably both. I think that it definitely gave the sense that they were a different metal band for better and worse. I've read, it's funny, that's such a classic, important part of Metallica's history. And if you read about the time, there are fans who, someone spit on James for making that video and said, like, you sold out, you made a video. And it's, I guess for better and worse, it presented a different Metallica. Funny, my writing hero, Rob Sheffield, who I asked for a blurb for the book, when I first met him, I asked him about, this was like ages ago. I asked him about something where he wrote about thinking Metallica was overrated. And he said, well, I mean, I could change my mind. I'm sure I'm just wrong. And I appreciate you asking me that. But the thing he said was, when I was a kid, I loved Headbangers Ball stuff. I loved Van Halen. I loved Guns N' Roses. And my intro Metallica was a 9-minute black and white video about a soldier telling the nurses to kill him in Morse code. And I was like, okay, this isn't for me. And, I mean, he's since grown to like Metallica, but it's such a powerful statement that you couldn't be on the fence about. You couldn't be like, oh, that was all right. I mean, it's for better and worse. It leaves an impression. You can never forget that video once you see it.
They vowed never to make a video prior to that. Isn't that the story too? And then they decided to do it. Why did they decide to make the video?
They said that if they were going to make one, they wanted to make it different and special because they talked for so long about not doing it. If you read old interviews, you can see that behind the scenes they were kind of thinking about it all along. And like even Cliff was saying, like, we might make a video someday. And, Lars was talking about doing one for maybe Sanitarium or songs like that. But I think that was the right moment. That was a time where they could do a video and not compromise themselves, where it could sort of build their artistic ambitions and credibility in a way that it might not for other bands.
How wild was that? Wouldn't that be played in between Poison's
Nothing
But a Good Time and Def Leppard's Pour Some Sugar on Me and Janet Jackson and Madonna? I mean, that was a dark video. I mean, that was some serious stuff.
It's such a dark video and it's such a powerful video. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one who saw that and was like, okay, I need to read Johnny Guy's Gun and watch the movie and want to find what happens to that guy. And it's you just can't take your eyes off of it. It's such a powerful piece of film.
Jason Robards, right? He's the actor in that.
Yeah. Jason Robards is in it. Yeah.
Who's the actor who plays the guy who loses his limbs?
Isn't that Timothy Bottoms?
Okay, so he's the one.
Yeah.
Just when you thought Metallica couldn't get any bigger, here comes the Black Album, released in 1991. It's produced by Bob Rock. This marks a distinct change in the sound, and while previous albums may have been subtle shifts, this one, it's slower, it's heavier, it's more refined. People know the songs: Enter Sandman, The Unforgiven, Nothing Else Matters, Wherever I May Roam, Sad But True, all get a ton of airplay on radio, MTV. Now the band's selling out arenas. They're on the cover of magazines, a #1 album in 10 countries. It's since gone on to become one of the best-selling albums of all time, 16 million plus sales. Chapter 16, you cover this Black Album, and you write, we're living in the world Metallica revolutionized, and there's no greater example of Metallica demolishing and rewriting norms than the Black Album. Few recordings are both as canonized and as controversial. Metallica fans became divided by this album. Now, some checked out, some stayed, but then there was a whole new generation of fans entering the picture. Where do you stand on this album?
Well, I'm a 90s kid, so by the time I got to Metallica, those songs were standards. I remember, I've got Kill 'Em All, I got Ride the Lightning. My third record was the Black Album. And it became, I don't want to say background music because it makes it sound like it wasn't that important to me, but it was just like a soundtrack. I mean, just, could be there for anything. So the Black Album is a big part of my life. I think you see now on the Blacklist with all these different covers, how many just different people all over the world and across genres it influenced. And I love the Black Album. When I got it, I was still a little too young to understand why somebody who liked Ride the Lightning and Kill 'Em All would not like the Black Album. To me, it was like all three of these records are heavy. They've all got great lyrics. They're all well played. They're all cool, And it's I had not yet been introduced to that idea that you can't like my band, right? That like, oh, my band's too popular now like, Squares like it. But yeah, I think that really one of the kind of big dividing points about it was that it was popular, is that it brought that stuff to the mainstream. I mean, it does have a lot of very heavy songs on it, like Holier Than Thou, and it's and Struggle Within, but I think it really alienated a lot of people by being so popular.
The songs that weren't the hit singles, what are the ones that stand out for you?
Well, one of the first ones I really stuck to is Don't Tread on Me. I love that song. I love The God That Fails. The lyrics are incredible. Of Wolf and Man. Through the Never has got some of the best lyrics, got a great groove to it. My Friend of Misery might have been the one I paid the least attention to, and then I heard that cover on the new Blacklist from Kamosi Washington. I was like, this is a great song, and I like all the deep cuts. It's a very good record front to back. It's an excellent record.
I heard somebody recently refer to themselves as a popularist. So if something was popular, they weren't going to like it, and then years later, when it's run its course, then they can go back and listen to it. But that's what happened with the Black Album.
Yeah, I think it took time for people to come around and be like, oh, this actually is a great record. And so, I mean, there were people who had not heard Metallica before who were like, what is this? And where's it been all my life? But yeah, sometimes it takes a while for that kind of thing to have its staying power, then people come back to it. I remember there's a author, John Jeremiah Sullivan, I like, who wrote a piece about Axl Rose where he said that that was the record that I got to be right to my brother with. And he'd be like, no, hard rock is lame. Listen to the Jam and the Clash. And then 20 years later, it lasted long enough. He's like, you know what? Guns N' Roses is cool. That was the thing that was good for me. And I think that people have that attitude about the Black Album too, where it's older metalheads, and then it lasts long enough now. Like, that's actually cool.
And it seemed to be just impervious to the grunge era. The album and Metallica in general just weren't affected by it.
They weren't. I think, it was a different kind of metal. I think it had a punk influence. I think that if anything, it made metal that alternative, kind of like Lollapalooza and grunge types could enjoy. And you read old reviews of Metallica and the Black Album from places like Spin that tended to focus more on bands like Jane's Addiction. They'll say like, Metallica finally made a good record, and it definitely had like a crossover to that kind of music in a way that other hard rock and metal bands did not.
There's a fascinating chapter on the works that inspired Metallica songs. I think fans will really enjoy this. This is an often untapped area of the band. There are films and books that weave their way into their music. Mm-hmm. Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls from 1940. That's the standout. But can you talk about some of the more obscure influences, which date as far back as the 1800s? And you also mentioned One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And could you talk about that? Stephen King.
Stephen King's obviously been a big metal influence for a long time. One thing, he's a big metalhead too, and on writing he writes about how he listens to Metallica when he writes books. But yeah, Kirk got the line "Ride the Lightning" from a sentence in The Stand. Dating back to the 1890s, the Lulu plays inspired the record with Lou Reed by Frank Wedekind. They're very shocking and controversial and sexual in their time, and still controversial to this day in some retellings. And I really enjoyed watching some of the older films that inspired songs. I mean, obviously One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a classic. I'd seen that, but I'd never seen Wolven with Albert Finney, which inspired A Wolf, a Wolf and Man. I'd never seen Magic, which inspired Sad But True, has a creepy movie with Anthony Hopkins. And they really just had so many... I'd never read Naming Names, the book that inspired Troy to Straw about the 1950s McCarthyism blacklisting, which was also fascinating because that tied in Dalton Trumbo, who wrote Johnny Got His Gun, which got turned into One. So it's I loved kind of connecting those dots and finding all the parts of Metallica history.
So let's wind down with Metallica in the 90s and beyond. More experimentation, more risks and adventures. They would continue with albums like 1996's Load, which includes Until It Sleeps and Hero of the Day, 1997's Reload, featuring The Memory Remains and Fuel, the covers album Garage Inc., 98. Yeah. That's got the covers of Turn the Page and Whiskey in the Jar. You mentioned the Thin Lizzy influence. 1999's S&M, the live album with an orchestra. What are the standout musical moments from Metallica in the 90s post-Black Album? Because there were those who thought Metallica was... You even wrote it. They were jumping on the alternative grunge rock bandwagon, but you write that's not the case.
Yeah. I don't think that's the case. They were photographed by Anton Corbijn, who famously photographed U2 and Depeche Mode, and they did have kind of like a Eurodance look, and especially like Lars and Kirk were getting into that stuff. But musically, they're more aligned with their kind of 70s influences in the band that they would cover on Garage Inc. If you listen to the actual songs, they don't sound like 90s alternative and grunge artists. They sound more like Thin Lizzy or Blue Oyster Cult or, even Skynyrd in some circumstances. They've got kind of like a 70s hard rock feel to them, and that, shows up on Garage Inc.
And it was also at the tail end of the 90s that Lars Ulrich made headlines for his battles with Napster. You write that many of his arguments look prescient now. What is your opinion of Lars and what he was so vocal about then, and how do you feel about it all these years later? Was it worth the backlash he received?
I think that he is absolutely morally and intellectually right about it. It is stealing. It is unfair to artists. I think that artists should be able to make a living off their music. I think that people should pay for music. I believe in music and supporting artists. I've done that most of my life. I think that people care more about music when they invest in it. If we're paying like $15 for a CD, you'd have to be like, okay, I'm not so hot on this at first, but I paid $15. I'm going to give another listen. Nowadays, if you stream it once you don't like it, you're not going to listen to it again. I think that there's a different attitude towards it. That might make me sound like an old man. That's how I feel. That said, I think that despite being like morally and intellectually right, I think that it was not worth pursuing. I think the world was changing that way. And And there's nothing that anyone in the music industry, its most powerful forces, could do to stop it. But yeah, it's still a real sore point for a lot of people, in particular older metalheads or my generation metalheads about that. Talk to younger fans, they've never heard about this thing. They don't care about it. I've talked to people like, wait, they sued streaming services? Okay, what happened? They sued like an illegal downloading service? What? So I think that it's becoming an increasingly small part of their legacy, but for a lot of people, it's still like a sore point. And people find a Metallica book and they're like, oh, they're going to sue you. It's still a thing that people get touchy about.
There's of course the downside. I'm old school like you, and I feel that way. There's a certain feeling you have when you, and I'm saying this, and I have Amazon Music Unlimited. It's not like I don't partake in this stuff, but when you, especially when you're in high school and you have maybe you have a small little job you do on the weekend, and like I didn't make much money. I spent it, and what I was going to spend that money on, that was a big deal. Like, do I want to invest in this album, in this, at the time, cassette? Do I want to put the money into this? And so you turn to radio to see how many singles, how many hit singles, how many good singles are off of this album. One, I don't know. Two, okay, I'm going to start. If it's three, if it's four, okay, then I'm going out and I'm going to get it because this is good and it's worth the money. Now, that's not the case. You don't have that emotional connection to it. However, on the other end of it is how many of these, for example, I discover Metallica only because my older brother has the cassette. So I don't have to make that investment. I don't have to make that decision. I just say, what the hell? It's there. It's free. I'll play it. Now I'm a huge Metallica fan. How many years later? 30 years later? So that's the upside to it. There are fans that discovered, and they're going to go out and buy a ticket to their concert. They're going to buy their T-shirts. They're going to buy their merchandise because they came across it on YouTube, had nothing to lose by hitting play. So that's the other side of it.
Yeah.
But that's years later. That's having a long time to process it all. At the time, Lars was, I think, right. I mean, think about working so hard on a book. You write a book, you spend years writing a book, and then it's just, here, go ahead, take it.
Yeah, intellectually, he was right. I believe in supporting artists. I believe in paying them. I have streaming services. That's the way of the world. That's the way things have changed. But you read interviews with old music critics, and they lament that nightlife now plays records and doesn't have live bands anymore. And they're like, musicians aren't getting paid now. It's just on a record. It's not like paying artists and. That just changes over time. It's not always to people's liking, but I think artists should be getting paid more. I don't know if it was worth them pursuing. It was kind of a lost cause, but I think they've adapted. I think that they've kind of outlived the music industry in that scandal. Don
Henley is a guy who's, from what I understand, he hires people to make sure they go on YouTube, and if there's anything that he wrote, if it's anything from the Eagles or Henley, take it down.
Prince was like that very rigidly before he passed away, and you could not find Prince videos online because he got someone to do that. So I'm sure that Metallica has a team of people who see what goes up and what are the best things to put online. But it's still a complicated question. I don't know what the right answer is.
I don't think there's a right answer. I was interested. I was a little surprised to hear. I interviewed Miles Copeland, legendary manager of the Police and IRS Records. He helped launch that, and I brought that up to him. I just in passing said, it's got to suck. These artists, they don't make nearly as much as they did back then when people bought albums. But he just said, but you know what? There's plenty of other ways they can make the money. And so they sell more merchandise. That's why a lot of these guys they got a hot sauce or they got a Sammy Hagar. Look how well he did with that tequila. So I guess if you could parlay that newfound audience through YouTube, through those people that just say, what the hell, let me just give this a listen because I don't have to buy it, they can then buy your merchandise. So I thought that was interesting that he's an old schooler and he said, no, man, no big deal, you just find other ways to make money. Okay.
But that's you do see that more and more too, where people get their exclusive beers or their exclusive hot sauce or their I guess during lockdown, I saw people releasing puzzles. There'd be the official Iron Maiden puzzle or Police, puzzle, a full album.
During lockdown, a lot of these artists ended up working on books and things like that. They had the time.
Dave Grohl's another one. Yeah.
Yep. And speaking of making money off of concerts, Metallica's draw as a live act only grew bigger into the 2000s, and then Robert Trujillo replaces Jason Newsted on bass in 2001. The conflicts and the struggles within the band circles become public knowledge. James went through his addiction struggles. The band members were at odds. Much of this captured on camera for the Some Kind of Monster documentary from 2004. But somehow they managed to stay together as a band. And then in 2003, we get Saint Anger. You write that Saint Anger marked the end of one of the strangest runs in metal history. You write, What in the fresh hell is Saint Anger? Was the disappointing result of this album due to the struggles that the band members have been going through? Should they have taken some time off to refocus before making the next album?
It sounds like they needed to let it out. You know, I read about how that was they purged the songs, they purged both the people they dedicated the record to. They dedicated it to Bob Rock, the producer, and Phil Towle, the therapist. It was something that they needed to do. And you see interviews at the time, they're like, we're so proud of this. And then like years later, they stopped playing it. But suddenly, like just last year, the S&M2 version of All in My Hands became like a #1 charting single. Phoebe Bridgers, talented new singer. She covers Nothing Else Matters on the box set. She did an interview with Lars and she said, I became a big Metallica fan because of Saint Anger. And I guess if you're younger and that's your first experience with it, maybe that's going to be your Metallica record. So it seems to have like a different life of its own. And it's a mysterious part of their legacy that still means a lot to some people.
Well, then there's the collaboration album with Lou Reed, Lulu. Mm-hmm. That came after they got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2009. 2011, Lulu comes out. They took a lot of hits for that one, but you aren't so unkind as other critics and fans with this album. You write, long after most of their thrash metal and rock peers settled into careers rehashing their early glories, Metallica and Lou Reed made a record unlike anything attempted in music before. And yet it's not such a strange pairing. Two of music's greatest shapeshifters moving swift with all senses clean. Should Metallica fans revisit this album?
I think so. You know what? Its 10th anniversary is in October. I'll be interested to see what kind of think pieces come out with it. Lou Reed is a famously contentious artist. You know, he made records that were horrible flops that people hated. And then years later, they get these reevaluations. I can understand why people don't like it. It's a pretty jarring record. It's not very tuneful and the lyrics are pretty graphic, and Lou is not really a singer. I mean, he kind of talks through the songs, but I think it's fascinating. And I'll be interested. I bet that, you've seen some people publicly, like, David Bowie or Howard Stern have said, like, hey, I like Lulu. And I bet that for the 10th anniversary in October, it came out on Halloween. For the 10th anniversary, there will be some reevaluation. Some, like, what did critics miss in Lulu?
Lou Reed was an interesting character. I worked at a radio station on the Connecticut-New York line, and a friend of mine who worked there way back in the day, long before I did, he told me a great story. He was doing the morning show, and Lou Reed was there. He was promoting some local thing. And he would ask Lou Reed a question, and Lou Reed would just go, yeah, no. So they go to commercial, and he's like, do you really want to be here? He's like, no. He goes, well, you can leave if you want to go. And he goes, okay. Wow. He's like, oh, my God. Wow. Yeah, he was...
he famously contentious guy, suffered no fools. I'm a big Lou Reed fan. I actually, one time I ran to him and his wife Laurie Anderson coming out of a movie theater, and I just could not talk to him because I was like, I was worried about that kind of thing happening. I was like, he's gonna be rude, he's gonna be tough, and I was like, he can never know that I love his music and all that, but I just like I'll let him be.
Death Magnetic, released in 2008. You write that was a return to form for Metallica, and that continued 8 years later with Hardwired to Self-Destruct. So you feel optimistic about what's to come from the band? You quote the lyrics in the band's classic Seek and Destroy from Kill 'Em All. Their murderous instincts won't go away until their dreams fulfilled, and it looks like there is no end in sight. So what do you expect to hear and see from Metallica next?
I think part of what makes Metallica such a great band to follow and write about and read about and think about is that we don't know. I mean, I never would have seen Lulu coming in a million years. I never would have seen a therapy movie coming. I never would have seen, after Saint Anger, I never would have seen Hardwired to Self-Destruct coming. They're just so, I never would have seen a movie like Through the Never coming. They're so unpredictable. I think that, one thing about Hardwired is that they're still improving. It's a step up from Death Magnetic. The best songs were the last ones written for the record. I think that, who knows? I mean, they've been all over the place before, and they probably will be again. But it looks like they're still getting stronger, and they're still strengthening themselves. And I really am excited to hear what they do next.
Metallica, the $24.95 book, that was released last month through Backbeat Books. It is available wherever books are sold. Any websites you want to direct people to get a copy?
I've got a bookshop page, which is bookshop.org/shop/Ben Apatoff. You can get the book from there. It supports indie booksellers. You can also see some of my writing influences on there too. So you can see I've got a list of books every metalhead should read and some books that inspired Metallica songs. So it's a good place to get the book. You can also get some other good books there, support indie retailers. I've got Lena's book up there, who wrote my intro. Catherine Turman, who was very helpful for the book. Her book is up there. So it's a good place to get books.
Okay, cool. You could send me the link if you want. I could put it on the show notes page.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
I will.
Any social media pages?
I've got a Twitter page. It's Bapatoff. It's twitter.com/BAPATOFF. And I have an Instagram page, which is Metallica Book. Instagram.com/Metallica Book. And I've got some music news and stuff about Metallica on there and a lot of good stuff.
Ben, thanks again for stopping by.
This was such a pleasure. Thanks so much. I will come back anytime and talk music with you. And yeah, keep me posted on Booked on Rock.
Thanks to Ben Apatoff for taking us through his book, Metallica, the $24.95 book. If you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just Ben, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore on our show notes page. Make sure you subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find all the ways to listen online at bookedonrock.com. We're also on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast, on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address, thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. And if you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Thanks for listening. Join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.